All right, folks. My name is Andy Finley. I'm going to be introducing Jeff here in just a moment. I guess that moment is now, actually. So I'm sitting in East Lansing, actually Okemos. Jeff is in State College, Pennsylvania, in a basement. And you're wherever you're at, but probably not on campus. So I welcome you to the Hanover seminar for today. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jeff Dozer. Jeff is a PhD student and, that I'm working with. He started at Michigan State in 2018. Prior to that, he was at a SUNY school, Geneseo. Is that how you pronounce it, Jeff?
Yep.
Where he pursued and completed a bachelor degree in biology and mathematics, I believe. He's currently working on a PhD in forestry, and I think is almost now or has now completed an applied statistics master's. Are you done with that, Jeff? Or are you still working on it?
Yeah, I'm in the last course for taking it right now. So
okay, so yeah. That's wrapped up pretty much. When Jeff got to Michigan State, I really tried hard to convince him to work in forestry with trees. Inference on tree populations is much easier because they stand still. They sort of appear and disappear, but they don't move around, which makes life a lot easier. But you know, much to my best efforts, Jeff decided to take the harder road and start working with wildlife populations. And I've learned a lot, and it's been really rewarding. So I thank Jeff for that, and I'll turn it over to him. But before I do, I was reminded to let everybody know that this is being recorded, and that if you don't want to be recorded, then turn off your camera. So take it away, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for that nice introduction. Looking forward to talking today about some of the projects I've been working on for my dissertation, and the topics are going to be surrounding forest bird monitoring using acoustic recordings and hierarchical models. And so to start off with this figure on the left here, it's a figure from a pretty landmark paper by Gerardo Caballos et al. In 2015. And what they have here on the x-axis is time dating back a couple centuries. And on the y-axis is the cumulative extinctions percentage of these species that are evaluated in the IUCN. And so what they have shown here with this dotted line is the background extinction rate we would expect under background circumstances. And what we see under the last kind of 200 years, we're seeing these very large extinction rates for a wide group of organisms. And in particular, I'll point your attention to birds that are kind of at the top of this list, where we see they're undergoing very large extinction rates. What the authors really nicely point out is that while these graphs are pretty striking, they're kind of ignoring the losses that take place in local populations. And so the losses in these populations is really what is kind of resulting in a decrease in ecosystem services that we rely on. So they're really somewhat understating the kind of problems that we're facing with this biodiversity crisis. And then what we have on the right is this another landmark paper from Ken Rosenberg and his colleagues at Cornell and the USGS, where they showed that over the last, or since 1970, there's been this cumulative decrease in 3 billion birds across all of North America, which is what's shown in panel A. And in panel B, what you see is that these lines are different groups of birds. And so ultimately this decline is happening across almost all of these different groups of birds. And so in the talk today, what I'm going to discuss is these two groups here, which are forest birds. And so what both of these papers really emphasize is that we need to have improved monitoring and conservation across really large spatiotemporal gradients in order to kind of reverse these trends if it's at all possible. And so, of course, informed management requires extensive monitoring. And so kind of the gold standard for bird monitoring is the use of point count surveys. And so the idea of a point count survey is kind of shown in this diagram here. And what we have is an observer represented by the binoculars will be at the center of a circle, and will count the number of birds that the observer identifies in this radius circle. And so the complexities that arise are often a result of the fact that the observer will tend to miss some birds within this point count radius. And so this process of missing these birds that are there is known as imperfect detection. And it's one of the many processes that makes bird monitoring complex. And so when you're doing these point count surveys, you need to account for this imperfect detection when you're modeling the data in order to obtain kind of these unbiased estimates that we want and we need for conservation and management. And then to go along with that, these point count surveys tend to require pretty high amounts of bird ID expertise. And if they're implemented by volunteers, then you need to train these volunteers, which can be quite expensive. And this concept of imperfect detection is definitely not new. It's been around for a while and known for a while, but the methods that can kind of account for it can potentially be costly and really time consuming across these large spatiotemporal regions that we want to monitor. And so ideally we want some alternative approaches to kind of perform this bird monitoring and address these complexities. So one of the ways in which we can potentially kind of account for these complexities and go about it in a different way is to use community science data. And for birds, especially due to their kind of prominence among the general public, there are these huge amounts of different sorts of community science programs that provide huge amounts of data that if we're able to develop statistical models, then we can potentially leverage the data to obtain some really good inference on bird populations and communities. And so I'm not going to talk about community science for the rest of the presentation today, but if you do stick around for a year or so, when I talk about the rest of my dissertation work, I will talk more about that then. Alternatively, what we can imagine doing is using acoustic recorders. And so if we place an acoustic recording out in a forest instead of a human observer goes to do a point count survey, what we can get from this is kind of this permanent record of the sounds that were picked up by that acoustic recording. And so what we can do is we can go back and listen to the recording and figure out what species are in the recording, or we can imagine kind of putting this acoustic recording into some clustering algorithm, which then identifies the species in the recording, and we can ultimately use that to study bird populations. And so I'm going to talk a bit about an approach like that later in the presentation. Additionally, the acoustic recordings provide us with information on soundscapes. And so a soundscape is the total amount of sound in a given area. And so when you go for a walk in the woods, one of the first sounds that you're likely to hear is some form of anthropogenic noise, where that's sound produced by humans or the machines we produce. And so three common sources of that are airplanes, automobile traffic, and hydrofracking. There's also these natural abiotic sounds that you'll probably hear, so sounds like wind and rain. And then, of course, there are the biological sounds from the living organisms that communicate in these areas. And it's really these biological sounds that contain a huge amount of data that can potentially be very useful for ecological studies. And we can kind of assess different aspects of community composition, population dynamics, or behavior by studying these biological sounds. And so by working with soundscapes can potentially be an alternative to bird monitoring across large regions. And so these are kind of three of the complexities I mentioned before. And there's, of course, additional complexities of bird monitoring that I'm just going to kind of skim over. But one of the biggest ones is the fact that we often need pretty large sample sizes in order to assess the effects of different covariates on kind of bird changes across space and time. And so to kind of address all of these complexities, I'm going to emphasize the use of hierarchical modeling approaches throughout this presentation. So hierarchical models are extremely prominent in wildlife ecology due to their ability to kind of separate out different sorts of measurement processes from the ecological processes we're interested in. And so to put that kind of all together in this broad overview, I imagine my dissertation work kind of is utilizing these three different monitoring approaches. So you have acoustic recordings, point count surveys, and community science data. And then from these different monitoring approaches, you can envision these different types of data coming from them. So acoustic recordings, you can extract information about soundscapes, or you can use species-specific vocalizations in the acoustic recording. The point count surveys provide us with counts of the species at an area, whereas community science data give us different types of species observations. And to accommodate all of the complexities in these data, I'm going to emphasize the use of hierarchical models as a statistical paradigm to use throughout these different types of monitoring approaches and data types. By using these hierarchical models, what we can ultimately do is obtain the desired inference on bird populations and communities to kind of inform management and conservation. And so I'm going to talk about 4 projects today, and each of these projects kind of fall along this pathway in some different way. And so the first project I'm going to discuss kind of takes this leftmost pathway using acoustic recordings and soundscapes and hierarchical models. And so going back to this kind of diagram of a soundscape, there's really been fairly little quantification of any of the pathways along this framework. And so what we set out to do in this project was to quantify this pathway between automobile traffic, anthropogenic noise, and biological sounds. So the first goal was to be able to develop a model that can characterize the relationship between all of these variables. And then if we're able to successfully develop that model, what we wanted to see was if we could use publicly available traffic data from the state of New York to obtain predictions of anthropogenic noise and biological sounds in soundscape maps across areas where we don't have soundscape recordings. And doing something like this could potentially be useful in management of noise pollution in potential areas of biological hotspots. And so to go about doing that, what we did was we obtained recordings at 18 sites throughout the Western New York region, kind of around the Rochester area. And at each of these 18 sites, we obtained recordings at the morning, afternoon, and evening. And for each of these time periods, we obtained a 29-minute recording, and then we broke it up into 1-minute segments. So ultimately, we had a total of 1,566 1-minute sound bites. And one way to visualize sound coming from an acoustic recorder is to use what's called a spectrogram, which is what's shown here. And on the x-axis, we have time, and then the y-axis, we have the frequency of sounds. And so we wanted some way to summarize the amount of anthropogenic and biological sounds in the soundscape. And one way that's commonly used in these soundscapes of kind of terrestrial forests, which is what these were, was to kind of compute a measure that ranged from 0 to 1 that quantified the amount of sound below 2 kilohertz. And then we use that as our measure of anthropogenic noise. And then above this threshold, most of the sound in the soundscape belongs to birds. And we quantify a measure from 0 to 1 that represents the total amount of biological sounds in that soundscape. And then additionally, what we did was we kind of extracted data from a publicly available traffic data set in the state of New York. And we kind of computed this composite variable that took in numerous different aspects of the road network throughout the state of New York and created what we call a road covariate, which ultimately quantifies the potential of a road to kind of contribute to the anthropogenic noise in a soundscape. And this is kind of our sample region that we're working with in Western New York. And what we see is that these values are very high along major roads and in more urban areas that are closer to the city of Rochester. And then in more kind of agricultural regions, these road covariate values are much smaller. And so the main goal here was to take this road covariate that we just computed, see how it relates to anthropogenic noise, and if we can predict anthropogenic noise from that road covariate, and subsequently predict the amount of biological sounds. So to do that, we kind of envisioned a two-stage model that we developed. I'm going to walk through it here. And so in the first stage, we have our road covariate, which we're trying to use to predict the amount of anthropogenic noise. And so the first thing to notice is that the data range from 0 to 1. And so to model these data, we use beta regression that allows us to model continuous variables that range between 0 and 1. Second thing to notice is that the data are really highly nonlinear in the sense that at low values of this road covariate, we obtain next to no information about the amount of anthropogenic noise, whereas at high values, quite certain there's large amounts of anthropogenic noise. And so to kind of obtain a smooth fit across this relationship, we used a model that incorporated basis splines, which are a good way to obtain a smooth fit across a nonlinear data set. And then in addition, as I mentioned, we obtained recordings at multiple times of the day. And so what we did was we incorporated multiple forms of temporal random effects in our model to improve our prediction and account for that sort of repeated measures aspect of the design. And so we fit this model, and what's shown here with the black line is the posterior median from our hierarchical Bayesian approach. And then the blue region is the 95% credible interval. So our model is able to accurately represent this relationship and also reflects the huge uncertainty at these low values and the smaller uncertainty at high values of the road covariate. And so since our goal is to go from a road covariate where we have no soundscape data to eventually predict the amount of biological sounds and anthropogenic noise, what we then do is we take the fitted predicted values from this first model and we send them into a second stage model where we use these predicted values as our covariate in the model to predict the amount of biological sounds. So by doing this, we're able to propagate all uncertainty from estimating anthropogenic noise from the road covariate. And ultimately, this resulted, we kind of used the same modeling approaches where we use beta regression, basis splines, and temporal random effects to model this relationship. And when we see our resulting model fit on this stage of the model, we again see a good fit to the data and that our model's accurately able to show that at high values of at low values of anthropogenic noise, there's high amounts of biological sounds. And then as anthropogenic noise increases, there's a smaller amount of biological sounds in the soundscape. And so we kind of accomplished the first task here by quantifying this relationship and developing this model. And so the next step was to see if we could produce these soundscape maps to predict anthropogenic noise and biological sounds at areas where we don't have soundscape recordings. And so that's what we set out to do, and shown here is the predicted value for anthropogenic noise. And what we saw was that at these major roads, we're seeing high values of anthropogenic noise, and then farther away from roads, we see low values. And then for biological sounds, we kind of see the opposite, whereas along major roads, there's smaller amounts of biological sounds, and then farther away, we have higher amounts of biological sounds. But you really have to take these maps with a grain of salt, because if you look at our uncertainty maps, the amounts of uncertainty are incredibly large. And this is because the data that's publicly available from the state of New York on traffic is really not temporally explicit enough to account for the variability in traffic across days, months, hours, or anything beyond the kind of yearly summaries that we got. And so ultimately, what we kind of conclude from this project is we're able to develop this modeling approach to quantify this relationship, and we can show we can produce these maps, but really we need more temporally explicit road data to be able to more accurately and precisely predict soundscapes in unsampled regions and potentially inform noise management. And so I'm now going to move on to my second project I'll talk about today, and it's again going to take the same framework along the left side of this diagram using soundscapes. And so I hope the first project kind of showed that these acoustic data can somewhat be messy, and you need some kind of efficient ways to be able to summarize them. And kind of one approach to summarizing acoustic data is to compute these metrics called acoustic indices, which are just these simple numeric values that kind of quantify different aspects of a soundscape. So what we wanted to do in this project was to develop a broad modeling framework that used acoustic indices together in a hierarchical model implemented in a Bayesian framework to provide inference on disturbance impacts on soundscapes and the underlying biological communities that they represent. And so specifically in this project, we developed this model and then we applied it to understand how a shelterwood logging influenced soundscapes in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. So on the right here is our study map. And again, this is in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. What we have in this shaded region are 4 control sites that are in this forest stand down here. And then in the surrounding region, we have 9 control sites that kind of surround these pair of lakes called Twin Lakes. And at each of these recording sites, what we did is we obtained 1 minute recording every 30 minutes from 2009 to 2018. So it's clearly a massive amount of data, and being able to obtain some sort of ecological inference from it needs some way to kind of succinctly summarize it together. And so the main goal for this data in this project was to assess the influence of the shelterwood logging in 2014. And so this logging took place on this well-stocked natural mixed pine forest stand in the bottom here in this dark shaded region. And ultimately what happened was there was a 73% basal area removal that occurred. And so in order to get kind of good inference from these data, we needed to accommodate the kind of large number of complexities that were there. And so the first and most important difference is that our control and treatment sites are not really perfect control and treatment sites. So ideally, the only difference between your control and treatment sites in any sort of design is that is the actual treatment themselves. But here, all of our control sites are kind of closer to these 2 lakes in the area as opposed to our treatment sites. So we need some way to accommodate these inherent differences between these sites in order to not improperly associate that with the logging. And then if you think back to the diagram of a soundscape and the different types of sound in a soundscape, one of those types was these natural abiotic sounds. And so one of these types of sound, in particular rain, can really influence these acoustic index measures. And we need to account for that in our modeling approach. And then these last 2 are kind of standard difficulties that we need to account for in any sort of long-term ecological study where we have lots of missing data and also this repeated measures design such that we have to include some sort of random effect to accommodate those repeated measures. And so to go about doing that, we again use a hierarchical modeling approach, which I'm going to kind of go through in this diagram here. And so what we envision is we have these individual soundscapes, and each individual soundscape is the soundscape at a specific location at a specific time of day. And so these individual soundscapes are measured t sub I times across the yearly period in which the study occurred. And for each of these recordings, what we did is we computed an acoustic index called the Normalized Different Soundscape Index, or NDSI. And what this index does is it ranges from -1 to 1, where -1 indicates this sort of unhealthy soundscape that's dominated by anthropogenic noise, and +1 indicates a more healthy soundscape that's dominated by biological sounds. And so what we do is we logit transform these NDSI values because that allows us to model the data in a linear mixed effects model, a pretty standard model. And so what we have is a mean structure where we have multiple fixed effects, and how we design these fixed effects is we include numerous kind of indicator variables that allows us to estimate the inherent differences between the control and treatment sites, allows us to estimate treatment effects and the rain effect as well. And then we include we include some random effects to accommodate our repeated measures design. And then we, of course, have our variance structure where we have our standard process variance or our residual variance, and then the variance that explains those individual, that's explained by the individual soundscapes that accommodates our repeated measurements. We again fit the model in a Bayesian framework, and what I have shown here are the posterior densities that are arising out of the model. And so to interpret this graph, basically if the density is overlapping if it's not overlapping or it's only slightly overlapping these vertical lines at 0, indicates the parameter is significantly different from 0. I'm going to draw your attention to kind of two of these graphs. So in particular, this one in the top left, which this parameter represents the differences between the control and treatment sites that's not a result of the shelterwood logging. So we see it's significantly positive, which indicates it's important that we include in our model and we account for these types of things when we're attempting to use soundscape data for understanding disturbance effects. And then I'll point your attention to alpha 13, which represents the effect that rain has. And we see this really strong negative effect. And it kind of indicates that in any sort of soundscape study, we really need to be sure that we incorporate and account for the effects that rain and other sorts of natural abiotic sounds can have on our resulting inference. So for these middle parameters, these are actually the treatment effects. And so I'm going to highlight that in this figure on the right here. So what we have on the x-axis is the 5 years after the shelterwood logging took place. And on the y-axis is the effect that the treatment had during that year. And so in order to interpret these, basically if the dots, which represent the posterior medians, and the lines, which are the 95% credible intervals, overlap with 0, it tells us that there's no significant difference between the soundscapes in that year than there was prior to the shelterwood logging. So it's really interesting is in these first 2 years, we see these strong negative effects on the NDSI values, which indicates the soundscapes in the first 2 years after the shelterwood logging are degraded towards more unhealthy soundscapes than they were prior to the shelterwood logging. But then the 3 years after that, we see a return to, or a pretty close to return to, these NDSI values that were observed prior to the shelterwood logging. So ultimately, what we conclude from this analysis with the NDSI is that there is this initial negative effect on the soundscapes, but there doesn't appear to be any long-lasting effects according to the NDSI. And for those of you familiar with landscape ecology, there's a huge number of indices that you can use to summarize a landscape. And it's exactly the same with these kind of acoustic soundscape studies as well. There's a ton of acoustic indices you can use. And so what we did was we extended our model to a multivariate framework, and we estimated how a bunch of different acoustic indices changed over this period as a result of the logging. We found some pretty cool stuff, and in particular with these first two indices at the top left here, H and AEI, what we saw is that they were almost always significantly different after the shelterwood logging than they were before. And it wasn't just the first 2 years, it was all 5 years. And these two measurements represent the evenness of sounds in a soundscape. So if you think back to the spectrogram that I showed with time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, basically what these measures are measuring is how evenly sounds are distributed across the y-axis. And so we see there's this difference after the shelterwood logging, and we're quite confident that this is a result of a shift in the avian community structure as a result of the logging. And so this isn't really surprising, given that we know there's a strong relationship between bird abundance and diversity with forest vertical structure. But it is interesting to note that we're seeing these changes with these evenness indices, but kind of the overall soundscape health remains the same. And so it kind of helps us kind of defend the fact that this modeling approach and the use of soundscapes as a kind of disturbance indicator can be a useful approach moving forward. And so for my third project, I'm going to step away from acoustic recordings for a bit and talk about some point count survey data that we worked with some national parks in the Northeast. And so given the mission of the National Park Service, they have implemented a series of inventory and monitoring networks across the US. And these networks are designed to kind of monitor trends across time and space among their parks across the US. And so in particular, there's a network in the Northeast called the Northeast Temperate Inventory and Monitoring Network, or the NETN, which has implemented this forest breeding bird monitoring program from 2006 to 2019. It's implemented this across these 8 parks in the Northeast that span from Acadia National Park in Maine down to Morristown in New Jersey. And ultimately what the parks desired was to obtain inference on all 106 bird species and understand how they're changing across this period from 2006 to 2019. And they wanted to obtain estimates for these species at each of these 8 parks as well. In addition to kind of the species-specific inference, they also wanted to understand how bird guilds or groups of species were changing across time. And additionally, they wanted some kind of standard park level summaries where they can kind of give an understanding of how the general bird community at each given park is changing across time. Then they also wanted to assess how bird abundance varied across space in relation to the forest structure. To go about doing this, the NETN implemented a series of point count surveys, which I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, following the what's called the removal sampling protocol. So under this protocol, what the observers will do is they'll stand in the middle of the location, they'll perform a standard point count survey where they're counting the individuals, but when they first encounter an individual, what they'll do is they'll record the time at which they do that, and then they will sort of mentally remove this bird from all subsequent counting so they don't count it again. And so by doing this mental removal protocol, we're able to estimate bird abundance and account for that imperfect detection process that happens when you miss these birds. So nicely, the NETN has these point count locations co-located with a series of forest vegetation monitoring plots. So we're able to relate changes we see in bird abundance potentially to changes in the vegetation structure of these parks. And this all kind of sounds relatively straightforward. You know, we're using this gold standard point count survey following a protocol for which methods are developed. But really where the complexities come in is that of these 106 species that we want to obtain inference on, most of them are really rare. And so we just don't have the sample sizes we need to be able to estimate trends in bird abundance across time or across space as well. And then additionally, there's these 8 total parks that we have, but many of these parks are quite small and there's really not that many point count locations at each of these parks. And so at some of these parks that are small, we're not even able to obtain estimates for the most abundant species, let alone the rare species. And so kind of left with this problem here, we can't use these standard methods to analyze these data, but we really need to obtain trends for all these species. And so to go about doing that, what we did is we developed this multi-region, multi-species removal sampling model. I'm going to walk through that here with a diagram that depicts what happens. And so what we get through these point count surveys is the number of each individual species I at each point count location J and each park R and during each year T. And so what these observations have is they kind of have 2 components to them, and we need to model both of these components. So the first component that we have is this detection process. And so imperfect detection, especially for birds, is known to vary across kind of the day of the breeding season when you're performing these point counts, varies depending on the time since sunrise. And then it also varies across different years, which can help account for changes in observers. We then have the second component of the model, which is what we're really most interested in, and that's the abundance component. So in this model, we include 4 covariates, where the first is years. So we're estimating this trend across the 13-year period. And then we have a variable that quantifies the amount of local forest cover within this 1 kilometer radius. And then we have 2 variables basal area and forest regeneration that kind of quantify the forest structure and help us understand how that relates to bird abundance. And so for each of these covariates across both components of the model, what we want to do is estimate a park-specific and species-specific effect for each of the 8 parks and the 106 bird species. And so to do that for the really rare bird species, what we do is we envision that these species-specific effects are kind of random effects that arise from a common park level distribution. And this park level distribution has a single parameter that describes how the community of birds at a given park responds to these different covariates. And by doing this, what we're able to do is get estimates for the rare species by kind of sharing information across the entire community of birds. And this solves the problem of kind of these rare bird species, but it doesn't solve the problem of the parks that are really sparsely sampled. And so we kind of take this a step further, where we have our park-specific effects being random effects that come from a common network level distribution. So we estimate the effects at the entire network level, where we get understanding of how birds across the entire network are responding to these different covariates. So by doing this in this sort of hierarchical manner, we're able to obtain the estimates for all bird species at all the 8 parks. So accomplish the tasks that we were set out to do. And in this diagram, we have some of the main results coming from the model that we implemented. And so at the top of this diagram, well, in general, what we're looking here is at the trends across the 13-year period. So looking at the network level, we have here the posterior mean followed by the 95% credible interval. And what we see across the entire network, kind of on the average, there's no significant trends in bird abundance across time. But what's interesting is if we go kind of to the park level, we see that there are 3 parks that are showing significant negative declines, and then there's 3 parks that are showing positive increases in bird abundance across time. Even further, we can look at the species-specific trends, which really reveals some cool stuff. And in particular, what we see is that at the 3 parks with negative declines, a large majority of the species are undergoing negative declines. So this red bar indicates the total number of species with negative declines versus the blue bar that indicates the species with positive trends in bird abundance. So we're seeing there's this real consistency in species within a given park that are kind of showing these same trends regardless of species. And it's even more prominent when looking at the 3 parks showing increases in bird abundance, where nearly all species are showing positive trends. So to take this a step further, what we did is we looked at how different guilds of birds were showing trends across time at each of these parks. So these guilds are just groups of birds, and they're grouped based on different aspects of their foraging strategies or life histories or things of that nature. And so this figure really re-emphasizes what I just mentioned in that last slide, in the sense that within a given park, across this wide variety of birds and guilds, we see very consistent trends within the park. But then if we go across parks, we're seeing this huge variability where we have some parks with major declines and then other parks with positive trends. And ultimately what this suggests to us is that there's some local forest conditions that are driving these consistent trends in bird abundance across an entire community of species, where these species really utilize a large variety of aspects of the forest structure. And so it's really somewhat concerning in the sense we want to figure out what's driving these trends, in particular the negative trends, in order to better understand why this is happening across this wide variety of species. And then in addition, as I mentioned, we estimated the effects of a few forest covariates on bird abundance. And what we have is showing these relationships across the 8 different parks in these graphs here. So in this first graph, y-axis is the kind of average species abundance, x-axis is basal area. And what we see is the bird abundance tends to peak at most of these parks at sort of mid-level amounts of basal area, which tends to make sense with what we know about bird abundance and diversity, in the sense that they're kind of going to peak when the vertical forest structure is most diverse, which tends to happen at these mid-levels of basal area. And then we see, in general, tend to be positive increases with bird abundance as percent forest increases. And then we really saw only a moderate effect of forest regeneration on bird abundance. And so while we were able to estimate these covariate effects on bird abundance, our power was limited to be able to assess how these effects were driving these trends that we're seeing across time. And so in order to do that, we kind of need some sort of alternative monitoring approach, or just increases in sample sizes and the number of point count surveys we're doing. And so this kind of leads in to the last project that I'm going to talk about today, where I started thinking about alternative ways in which we can combine data together to improve inference on bird abundance. And so the kind of downside of point count surveys is that it's hard to obtain replicates across time during a breeding season. And thinking about acoustic recordings, these are relatively easy to place outside, and then you can program them with your phone to obtain recordings multiple times across multiple days during a breeding season. So acoustic recordings have that ability to obtain temporal replication relatively easy compared to point count surveys. So this project sought to see if we could kind of combine the two monitoring approaches in a single integrated model to improve our inference on bird abundance. And I first want to just re-emphasize these two types of data that we're getting and we're imagining that we can combine together and improve our inference on bird abundance. So what we have for our first data set is these point count data that we've talked about a few times in this presentation. And the main thing we need to account for is the fact that imperfect detection is going to vary across space and time. The nice part about these data, though, is that we do get these counts of individual birds. And so it gives us a specific number of birds for each species we're interested in. Alternatively, what we can imagine doing is setting out an acoustic recorder at multiple sites and then getting multiple acoustic recordings at these sites. And then we take these acoustic recordings, and what we can do is put them as inputs into an automated, semi-automated clustering algorithm. And so what this semi-automated clustering algorithm does is it groups these vocalizations based on kind of their frequency and their characteristics into different clusters. So here we have M different clusters with a specific number of vocalizations in each cluster. What the algorithm doesn't do is it doesn't tell you what each cluster corresponds to. And so what we imagine doing in kind of the semi-automated process is that the human then goes in and listens to one or two of these recordings from each cluster, or these vocalizations from each cluster, and then says, yes, this first cluster is an eastern Wood-Pewee, the second cluster belongs to red-eyed vireo, and this mth cluster is a blue jay. And so that's kind of the semi-automated process we have that combines human verification of these clusters with the clustering of the algorithm, which kind of greatly reduces the amount of time you have to go in and listen to these recordings. And then since if you're interested in a single species, what you'll then do is filter out the data so you only take vocalizations from the clusters that correspond to your species of interest. And then ultimately what you're left with is this sort of matrix that I have down here. And ultimately you have multiple sites, which you have multiple recordings. And then at each of these site recording combinations, you have a number of vocalizations that the algorithm detected from your species of interest. And so the acoustic data are nice because we can get a lot of replication across time, but where the difficulties arise are when we think about modeling these data to estimate bird abundance. So the data we obtain in this matrix are not actually counts of individual birds. Rather, they are the number of vocalizations produced and detected in this recording. And so we have to relate these vocalizations to bird abundance, which isn't necessarily one-to-one or straightforward. Additionally, the clustering algorithm is going to have some false positives in the sense that not all of the vocalizations in the cluster will correspond to the species that you think they are. And so we need to estimate this false positive rate to get the inference we desire. And then additionally, imperfect detection and true positive rate of the clustering algorithm will vary across space and time as a result of the fact that bird vocalization rates vary across space and time due to weather and kind of the circumstances around the bird. And so typically in these types of models that have false positive rates, what we need to do in order to estimate the false positive rate is kind of manually validate some of the data. And so that's exactly what we do here. We envision that you need to validate something like 10% of the vocalizations where you go in and say, yes, this recording, this vocalization belongs to my species of interest, or no, this is a false positive. And what we envision is that you can combine these two data types together. So these acoustic vocalization data together with point count data, ultimately to estimate the abundance of a bird, which is really what you're interested in. And to test this out, we performed a simulation study comparing 4 different models that used different parts of this framework. And so our first model is model AV, which utilized the acoustic data, which is the A, and then the manually validated data, which is V. And so we use that to estimate bird abundance without any point count data. Our second model utilizes just the point count data to estimate bird abundance, and this is the standard and mixture model that we have. And then model AC is my favorite model out of the 4 models we have, because it combines acoustic vocalization data together with point count data to estimate bird abundance. But what it doesn't require is it doesn't require this additional information to validate any acoustic vocalizations. And this is because the point count data actually provides enough information to separate out the false positive rate from the true positive rate in the acoustic vocalization. So it's a really cool process that goes on there. And then this final model that we have utilizes the entire framework, where we additionally incorporate the validation data. And what we did was we performed a fairly extensive simulation study where we varied different aspects of this kind of concept. So we envisioned that there were different detection rates, being low detection and high detection, and different abundances of the species that we're trying to estimate. So what I'll draw your attention to in this graph is kind of this horizontal dotted line that we have. And so this is the true value of an abundance intercept that we're trying to estimate. And so what we see is if these dots are close to this line, it tells us that our models are getting accurate estimates of bird abundance. And so pretty much across all scenarios, all of our models were able to accurately estimate bird abundance. But what varied was the fact that our precision of bird abundance was much higher for our 2 integrated models than it was for any of the other 2 models that only incorporated a single data type. So in general, the results tell us that combining the 2 data types together can improve the precision at which we estimate bird abundance. Additionally, what's cool is that of the 2 integrated models, there wasn't too much of a difference between model AVC, which incorporates the validation data, and model AC, which doesn't require the validation data. So it potentially suggests we really won't need to validate large amounts of acoustic data to estimate bird abundance relatively precisely. And then really quickly, what we did was we did this really small case study looking at the eastern Wood-Pewee, and we wanted to assess trends across this a national historical park in Vermont. And so it was a pretty stringent test of our modeling framework because we had point count data that were at 25 sites. There was barely any temporal replication, whereas we had these acoustic data that were at 4 sites with lots of temporal replication, but 4 sites is an extremely small number of sites. And so kind of both of these data types have problems with them, but we wanted to see if our integrated models together could kind of provide us with the inference that we wanted on bird abundance. And so what we did was we estimated a bird abundance intercept using our 4 models. What we saw was that our 2 integrated models had really precise estimates of of the abundance intercept. And we were able to get those estimates. And we also assessed how the eastern Wood-Pewee varied across time, which was a 3-year period where we had these data. What we saw was that our 2 integrated models, again, performed very well. And what we did was we actually compared these trends to the trends we found with our removal sampling model in the 3rd project. We saw that they lined up really well, which tells us that this process of integrating acoustic and point count data can actually provide us with these good estimates of bird abundance, how it varies across space and time. And so ultimately, from the simulation study and the case study, we kind of proposed this efficient monitoring approach where we think a good way to estimate bird abundance is to implement many acoustic recorders across the study region, perform a small number of these high quality point counts, which are point counts with a large amount of temporal replication within a given breeding season, and then use one of our integrated models, in particular model AC, which doesn't require any validation of the acoustic vocalizations, and you'll be able to get pretty good estimates of bird abundance. And so I'm currently working with our collaborator Aaron Weed on establishing a protocol in multiple northeastern US forests to assess how we can utilize acoustic recordings to better understand how bird abundance varies with different silvicultural treatments and different aspects of vegetation structure of forests. And with that, I'd like to kind of thank Andy for his guidance on these projects, and my committee members, Elise, Gary, and Rob, and then a bunch of my co-authors on this work that really provided a lot of great feedback and help. And then, of course, to Aaron and Stu for providing me with data, because except for the first study, I kind of spend much of my time at the computer and kind of steal other people's data. So it's nice that they provide that stuff to me. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions if anybody has anything to ask.
Hi, Jeff. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so you took a look at the correlation between the forest regeneration and the bird species abundance, and what is the rationale to take a look at the correlation between them? Like, is it like a disturbance or something like that?
Yeah, so forest regeneration can be, in particular, a good predictor of bird abundance for those bird species that kind of hang out a lot in the lower vegetation of the forest structure. So our idea was to see if these measurements of forest regeneration could help us understand how they were varying across space for those species. And it was particularly interesting in those regions because a lot of those parks had a lot of deer browsing that they were interested in understanding. And so this forest regeneration, along with understanding bird abundance, was kind of a way to kind of look more into how deer browsing was assessing or impacting the regeneration and subsequently potentially the bird community as well.
That's really interesting. And what is the implication of the intensity of deer browsing effect to the bird abundance?
Yeah. I mean, that's something that we definitely want to parse out more. What was interesting is it really didn't have that strong of an effect, even with those guilds of birds that we thought it would have a really strong effect. But ultimately, that's something we want to kind of parse apart more using acoustic recordings and really kind of figure out those effects that are going on there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I noticed that the exotic bird species increased across the different parks, and are they like invasive species?
Yeah. So that exotic group was invasive species. So that's a really good observation, because like that positive trend for that group of birds isn't necessarily a good thing, right? So that's something that we are thinking about as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Jeff. This is Michael Fox.
Hi.
I was wondering if you noticed any correlation between species that were more tolerant of noise.
That's a really good observation. We didn't actually look at that, but that would be something really useful to incorporate in our models to see if we're getting some sort of relationship between birds that can potentially like adapt their vocalizations more to noise than other birds, and see how our metrics kind of line up across those birds. It's a really good observation.
Also, this is kind of an aside, but did you come across any information related to any regulation of noise in different communities or geographic areas?
No, there in my second case study where we looked at soundscape disturbance. So there, those two lakes, those twin lakes, there actually are some noise management kind of mandates that they have to regulate the amount of sounds on the lake. So that's the only area we've seen it. There's also some work, not in these specific national parks, but across other national parks where they do have kind of these programs to potentially mitigate the amounts of sounds that are in the area. Because there are a lot of implications on kind of enjoyment of recreation and even human health as well in terms of noise.
Yeah, I know that the Park Service is probably leading the way on a lot of the noise studies.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big thing, especially out west with there's a lot of aircraft that really impedes a lot of the major parks out west.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
Jeff, it looks like there's a question on chat.
Oh, cool. Can you read it to me by chance? I can't seem to find where the chat is.
Yeah, it says, thank you for the nice talk, Jeff. I have one question. In Project 2, the PSD9 and PSD10 variables look like they did not recover in the years after the logging activity. Do you have an ecological explanation for this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So those two metrics are measurements of sound in frequency ranges of 9 to 10 kilohertz and I think 8 to 9 kilohertz. So those are kind of at the upward levels of the frequency at which the birds in the areas communicate. And so I haven't dug into the specific species that could potentially have changed as a result of that. But what it does, it just kind of reemphasizes the point that I made in the sense that there's probably this change in the community structure of birds because birds use different parts of that frequency spectrum to communicate. So that kind of supports that idea that there's different birds in the area before than after the shelterwood logging, which results in those changes.
Excellent. Looks like we have time for maybe one more question, if there's one in the audience.
Yes, Jeff, this is Bob Westfall.
Hi, Bob.
I'm MSU grad and a recently retired Forest Service scientist. It seems to me from the first part of your talk, you're using wavelets to decompose your acoustic profiles.
Yeah, so it's not quite wavelets, but these indices that I talked about, they kind of summarize the acoustic spectrum in a different way. So they kind of if you just imagine a spectrogram, it's just basically summing up the kind of different components of that, and then looking at how it varies across really small temporal scales. But there is some work with wavelets, and there's actually a lot of use of wavelets in some of the kind of machine learning algorithms to attempt to automatically identify these birds via their vocalizations.
Oh, cool. My colleague Connie Millar and I have been studying the American pika and have made some acoustic recordings of them. Interestingly, they have dialects also, so you can pull those out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, wavelets have a lot of information potentially that you can extract and use those for bird vocalizations.
Yeah, I've done work on tree ring analysis too, and have extracted frequency domains from those from the wavelets of those time series, and those have been really useful.
Yeah, that's very cool. Definitely some potential to use them with bird vocalizations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any last questions? Let's all virtually thank Jeff, and if you do have lingering questions, you can virtually get a hold of him via his email. He's quite responsive, I've found. So thank you, Jeff, and we all appreciate it, and a really great talk.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you coming.